our opposition to the collective punishment of people in Gaza, and our opposition to the forced transfer targeting Palestinian civilians. In the same vein, all those held captive should be released. Easing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is most pressing. It is imperative to fully deliver on the Security Council's Resolution 2712, clear the obstacles hindering the access of sufficient humanitarian supplies, and create conditions for humanitarian agencies to carry out their work safely. Relying only on the Rafah crossing to transport humanitarian supplies to Gaza is far from enough. More assistance corridors to Gaza should be opened, and the United Nations should play a greater role in monitoring and coordinating humanitarian efforts in Gaza. Since the conflict broke out, China has provided to the Palestinian National Authority and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East cash assistance, respectively, and we have provided to Gaza food, medicine, and other emergency humanitarian supplies. I'd like to announce that the Chinese government will provide to Gaza another batch of emergency humanitarian supplies. Third, we should revitalize the political prospects of the two-state solution with stronger determination. Israel has long established an independent state, and the Jews are no longer without a home. But the right of the Palestinian people to statehood, their right to existence, and their right of return have long been ignored. This is the crux of the repeated turbulence in the Palestinian-Israeli situation. Fairness and justice on the Palestinian question lies in the two-state solution. This is irreplaceable. Only the true and comprehensive implementation of the two-state solution can restore peace to the Middle East, realize peaceful coexistence between the two states of Palestine and Israel, and achieve common development of the Arabs and Jews. China calls for ramping up international and regional diplomatic efforts, reshaping credible multilateral processes, revitalizing the political prospects of the two-state solution, and restarting direct negotiations between Palestine and Israel. We advocate holding a more broad-based, large-scale, and effective international peace conference, and we support Palestine in becoming a full member of the United Nations. No solution to the current crisis should go against the two-state solution, or violate norms of international law or relevant UN resolutions. Any arrangement concerning the future of Palestine should fully reflect the will of the Palestinian people and accommodate the legitimate concerns of countries in the region. Fourth, we should work for responsible and meaningful action taken by the Security Council. The Charter of the United Nations confers on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. The Security Council should shoulder its responsibility on major issues of war and peace and life and death. It should heed the calls of Arab and Islamic countries and the international community, and in light of the development on the ground, take further action promptly. China has submitted our position paper on resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, laying out principles and positions of the international community in 5 areas, namely implementing a comprehensive ceasefire and ending the fighting, protecting civilians effectively, ensuring humanitarian assistance, enhancing diplomatic mediation, and seeking political settlement through implementing the two-state solution. And China will continue to strengthen coordination and pool consensus with relevant parties to see that the Security Council assumes its due responsibilities of performing duties for peace and speaking up for justice. Colleagues, today we are joined by many high-level delegates from Arab and Islamic countries. Previously, they visited multiple countries as a delegation of 4 ministers, and I exchanged views with them in depth in Beijing. Their mediation efforts demonstrate a strong desire to end the fighting in Gaza and achieve peace in the Middle East. And today's meeting carries the keen expectation of Arab and Islamic countries for the United Nations and its Security Council. I hope you will pool your insight and answer our common question and contribute your part to realizing a ceasefire and ending the fighting at an early date, easing the humanitarian crisis, achieving peaceful coexistence between Palestine and Israel, and realizing lasting stability and security in the Middle East. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Mauro Vieira, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Brazil.
Mr. President, I thank the Chinese presidency for elevating this meeting on the situation in the Middle East to a high-level event. The matter is of utmost importance and urgency to Brazil, of which is example the current official visit of President Lula to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, where he is exchanging views with the main stakeholders on the situation in the region. As we convene today on the International Day of the Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we are compelled to acknowledge that the time is not for commemoration. After hearing the Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the Special Coordinator Thor Venesland on the unprecedented horror taking place in Gaza after the terror attack of October 7th and the 48 consecutive days of unrelenting bombardments that followed it, solidarity is certainly not the first word that comes to anyone's mind. Solidarity implies unity, and in the Security Council, we too have to stand in unity and solidarity for all those in need. The situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question, is, however, one of the most vital matters of the Security Council. Such record is an unfortunate testament to the fact that more often than not, disagreements triumph over common interest in this body. Yet the conflict in the Middle East has not disappeared, as we have been failing to see eye to eye in the Security Council. Much to the contrary, we have continuously heard reports of actions that have been undermining the viability of a Palestinian state and the fulfillment of the General Assembly Resolution 181 of 1947 on the establishment of the two states living side by side in peace and security within mutually accepted and internationally recognized borders. The worsening situation in the past years between Israel and Palestine has not compelled us to unite and take action towards the shared goal of achieving peace to the Palestinians, the Israelis, and the people in the Middle East at large. As we are now appalled by the spiral of violence and the intolerable loss of innocent lives, both in Israel and Palestine, as we worry at the very concrete possibility of regional spillover, we have to hold the Security Council accountable to in its main obligation to uphold international peace and security. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, what's worse, we did not unite in the past, and we do not seem to be ready to unite now. The Gaza Strip is grappling with unacceptable levels of violence. More than 5,000 children have perished. We have heard Catherine Russell, director of UNICEF, state unequivocally that the Gaza Strip is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. The number of civilian lives lost exceeds 14,000. The plight of women, particularly pregnant women in Gaza, is deeply disturbing. The displacement figures are staggering, reaching nearly 1.7 million people, or 80% of Gaza population. An estimated number of 41,000 houses were destroyed or severely damaged. A total of 18 hospitals were shut down. The number of trucks with humanitarian assistance is utterly insufficient to attend the basic needs of the population, such as food, water, medicine, and fuel. Alleged violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law continue as civilian infrastructure are destroyed. The alarming death toll of over 100 UN staff people is a tragic record in history. In this light, Mr. President, this Council and the international community must join forces to ensure that the end of violence, as well as to grant unhindered, sustainable, and predictable humanitarian aid to Gaza. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, we also stand unequivocally in solidarity with the Israeli families whose innocent members were made hostages. In this light, Brazil welcomes the release of 74 hostages in the past days. However, 167 individuals are still held in captivity. We share the pain and unbearable suffering of their families. We cannot bear the idea of children taken from their families under no circumstance and without any justification. This is why we reiterate our call for the safe and unconditional liberation of all innocent people. Brazil welcomes the recent truce deal between the parties, achieved through the mediation of Qatar and supported by Egypt and the United States. Although contingent and temporary, halting hostilities and facilitating the release of numerous captives is a sign that agreement is possible even when it seems unreachable and unattainable. While acknowledging the efforts of the mediators of this encouraging diplomatic development, Brazil also welcomes the news of the extension of the truce for another 2 days. Violence, terror, and the forceful measures only breed hatred and fuel a never-ending cycle of hostilities. We therefore urge all parties to cling to this spark of hope and encourage them to uphold this vital agreement. Mr. President, the truce is a first step towards a de-escalation of violence. It should encourage us to overcome difference and cooperate ambitiously. While recognizing the relevance of the Security Council Resolution 2712 of 2023 and its call for humanitarian pauses and corridors in Gaza, Brazil is of the view that the Council must do more. It must unite to adopt a more decisive and comprehensive course of action that can consolidate gains, sustainably and predictably address the dire situation on the ground, and foster a safer and more hopeful future. Echoing President Lula's recent remarks on the matter, we very much hope that this agreement on a short humanitarian truce, a modest sign of hope amidst an appalling human tragedy, can show a way to peace and lay the groundwork for the resumption of the peace process between Israel and Palestine. In this endeavor, we must not lose sight of the need to address the root causes of the Palestinian issue through dialogue, political will, and good diplomacy. This process needs to be fully inclusive, considering the perspective of all relevant stakeholders. Every country and partner with influence over the parties must be called to shoulder their responsibility to reach a lasting solution for this central issue. And of course, this Council should also live up to its responsibilities. Barring the two-state solution is barring any prospect for peace. A viable Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel, within mutually accepted internationally recognized border, is the fulfillment of the Palestinian self-determination. But it is also the most crucial interest of all peace-loving countries that belong to the United Nations. Any initiative in the form of an international conference, as some member states have proposed, with a view to implementing the two-state solution, counts with the Brazilian unequivocal support. Mr. President, the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians and Israelis for peace and security in their own countries cannot be overlooked or neglected any longer. As I tried to convey here today, solidarity is not only a moral obligation, it's the Security Council's duty. In order to discharge its responsibilities for the maintenance of international peace and security, as enshrined in the UN Charter, the Security Council must unite around the common good and raise above any individual interest of its members. Thank you.
感谢。
I thank His Excellency Mr. Vieira for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency of the United Kingdom, Lord Tariq Ahmed of Wimbledon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies, may I begin by thanking Secretary-General Guterres and Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for their detailed briefings. As we look towards the Middle East, a tragedy is unfolding in front of our very eyes. Israel has suffered the worst terror attack in its history. And Palestinians are experiencing a devastating and growing humanitarian crisis as a result of the ensuing Israeli military action. Mr. President, every life matters, Israeli or Palestinian. Every innocent civilian life lost, Palestinian or Israeli, is a tragedy. Indeed, we also collectively mourn the loss of all innocent lives lost, including those of UN personnel delivering vital life-saving aid in Gaza. Yet the past week has provided much-needed respite in hostilities. The agreement was an important opportunity for providing hope and relief to the families of the hostages and for allowing vital humanitarian assistance into Gaza. But this should not be a one-off. We must collectively build from it and create the opportunity for more, including follow-up and ensuring more humanitarian grounds for such cessation. Hostages must be released, aid must get in, and civilians must be protected. I've had the opportunity to visit Qatar recently to discuss this very conflict and take the opportunity to recognize their pivotal role in this agreement together with that of Egypt and the United States. Just last week, the United Kingdom Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, visited Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, where he met with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. During their meetings, they discussed the importance of securing the release of hostages, addressing the humanitarian crisis, which included the British Foreign Secretary announcing a further $38 million in UK humanitarian aid, and also emphasizing the need to find a long-term political solution to this conflict based on the two-state solution. In Israel, he discussed the need to immediately de-escalate in the West Bank, where tragically more than 200 Palestinians have been killed, and to prevent further escalation, which disrupts regional peace and security, concerns we all share. And whilst we welcome statements condemning settler violence, the United Kingdom is clear. There must be justice, and Israel must hold those responsible to account. Equally, the UK's position on Israeli settlements is also clear and long-standing. They are illegal under international law and contrary to the cause of peace. The UK is also clear that Iran poses an unacceptable threat to the region through its destabilizing activity and long-term support for its proxies and partners in the region, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We condemn the unlawful seizure of the MV Galaxy leader and call for the immediate and unconditional release of the ship and its crew. On our part, across the region, the United Kingdom is working intensively with all partners on this particular issue, on the importance of humanitarian relief, on the importance of hostage relief, on the importance of preventing further escalation. The UK also further echoes UNIFIL's call for a cessation of hostilities across the Blue Line and for a renewed commitment to implementing UN Security Council Resolution 1701. The UK, from the start of events through the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October, has been clear that Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorism. But in doing so, Israel must act in accordance with international law, of which safeguarding civilian life is key and pivotal. Frankly, tragically, too many innocent civilians, including many children, have lost their lives. And we must work collectively to find solutions to this long-standing conflict. Ultimately, we must find that pathway to peace and ensure, yes, events like October the 7th never happen again. And therefore, equally, let us commit ourselves to ensure we deliver sustainable peace. The United Kingdom believes a negotiated settlement in line with Security Council resolutions leading to a safe and secure Israel, living alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. A vision, but to which we must now all work together to turn that vision into a reality. A reality of ensuring security, a reality of ensuring justice, a reality of ensuring peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. This must be our shared, long-term, deliverable objective. Peace may seem difficult, but, Mr. President, peace is achievable. Peace is attainable, and we must work together to deliver that noble goal. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Lord Ahmed for his remarks. I now invite the representative from the United States, Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Secretary General Guterres and Special Coordinator Winsland, for your briefing. I also join in welcoming the many ministers with us here today. Colleagues, we're now on the 6th day of the humanitarian pause in Gaza, a pause that, amidst the darkness of a conflict that Hamas set into motion, has been a glimmer of hope. A pause that, quite frankly, would not have been possible without the leadership of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States. From day one, the United States' approach to this conflict has been driven by direct, personal, presidential diplomacy. Diplomacy is hard. A lot of it takes place behind the scenes. And while the work we do in this chamber is tremendously important, oftentimes progress happens outside these walls. Take the humanitarian pause we helped to broker. Water, food, fuel, and other essentials are now reaching Palestinian civilians in the south and, crucially, the north. And this week, the United States is airlifting UN medical items, food aid, and winter necessities to the region. Just yesterday, we delivered over 54,000 pounds of assistance to the humanitarian logistics hub. During the first 5 days of the humanitarian pause, we saw approximately 1,000 trucks enter Gaza, and there are more regular shipments of fuel going to UNRWA. But more humanitarian assistance is needed, much more. So we must do everything possible to scale up aid, and all parties must do everything possible to protect civilians, including UNRWA staff and journalists. The United States has urged Israel to take every possible measure to prevent civilian casualties as it exercises its rights to safeguard its people from acts of terror. We know Hamas continues to use civilians as human shields, purposefully, cruelly, putting Palestinian civilians in harm's way. But this does not lessen Israel's responsibility to protect civilians, consistent with international humanitarian law. Colleagues, during this pause, we have welcomed the release of hostages who were pried away from their families by Hamas. We've seen emotional reunions, children running to embrace their parents, families back together, finally able to breathe a sigh of relief after weeks of agony. I simply cannot imagine what these hostages and families have been through. None of us can. I think about Abigail Eden, a 4-year-old girl who was freed this week, but whose parents were killed by Hamas right in front of her eyes. And Yafa Adar, an elderly woman, bravely showing her face steelily, now free, now able to smile once again. This is Hamas Clearly, there's no one too young or too old for its terror. These are horrors they celebrate, and these are horrors some member states still refuse to condemn. And it is unacceptable and it's outrageous. Colleagues, even as we welcome the release of these hostages, so many others are not yet free, and their families are still living in hell, unsure when or if they will see their loved ones again. And I think of Hirsch Gober Poland and his parents with whom I met. To those families, I want to say this: we will not rest until all hostages held by Hamas and other groups are released, every single one. Toward that end, we want to see this humanitarian pause extended. Israel has been very clear that it is prepared to continue the pause in fighting for every day that Hamas releases an additional 10 hostages. The ball is now in Hamas's court. And if Hamas decides not to extend this deal, the responsibility will rest squarely on its shoulders. Colleagues, while the last week has been a source of hope, I want to raise 3 deeply troubling developments. First, we continue to be concerned by the possibility of further spillover of this conflict. In particular, the United States does not want to see conflict in Lebanon, where escalation would have grave implications for regional peace and security and for the well-being of the Lebanese people. Restoring calm along the Israel-Lebanon border is of utmost importance, and fully implementing Security Council Resolution 1701 is a key component of this effort. UNIFIL plays a vital role along the Blue Line, and we expect all parties will ensure the safety of peacekeepers. We also call on this council to condemn in the strongest terms the recent Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, which pose a significant risk to the maritime security of vessels. These attacks must cease, and the MV Galaxy leader and its crew must be immediately released. Second, we are deeply troubled by the sharp rise in violence by extremist Israeli settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank. Extremists that attack civilians in the West Bank must be held accountable, and this violence must stop. And President Biden has made clear that the United States is prepared to take action, including by issuing visa bans against these extremists. We strongly oppose the advancement of settlements in the West Bank, which undermines the possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state. Third, we call on all parties in the region and people around the world to refrain from inflammatory rhetoric that exacerbates tension and hate. That includes dehumanizing language. Over the past 2 months, we've seen a spike in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We see this playing out online, across social media, and we also see it in our communities, where hate begets violence. The violent attack on 3 students of Palestinian descent in Vermont was horrific. We all have a responsibility to condemn all of these attacks. Colleagues, even as we focus on the immediate tasks before us, we must look forward to a better future, so the next generation of children will never know the horrors of terror and conflict, so that we can stamp out the distrust and the trauma that continues to plague the region. And so Israelis and Palestinians can secure a future free from Hamas and free from terror. Because let's be clear, an outcome that leaves Hamas in control of Gaza would deny Palestinian civilians the chance to build something better for themselves, and it would also expose Israel to the possibility of future attacks. We need a 2-state solution where Gaza and the West Bank are reunited under a single governance structure ultimately under a revitalized Palestinian Authority. This is the only guarantor of a secure and democratic Israel. This is the only guarantor of Palestinians realizing their legitimate aspirations to a state of their own. This is the only way to end this cycle of violence once and for all. Progress will not come overnight. Peace is never easily won, and diplomacy requires hard work. But that must not deter us. Let us work together. We must commit to diplomacy, and let us do everything possible at long last, deliver on the promise of peace and the hope for a brighter future. Thank you, Mr. President.
感谢。
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Thomas Greenfield for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Khalifa Shaheen Al Mahar, Minister of State of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Special Envoy Tor Wensland for their critical briefings. We greatly appreciate the efforts of the UN and the sacrifices by the UN staff to provide assistance to the Gaza Strip during this difficult time. Mr. President, in an area no larger than 365 square kilometers, more than 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are enduring a brutal Israeli aggression that does not respect human values or adhere to international laws and norms. More than 15,000 targets were bombed in this confined space, killing at least 14,000 Palestinians, predominantly women and children. According to the United Nations, medical teams, journalists, and humanitarian workers have not been spared. This has profoundly shaken the global conscience in an unprecedented manner. These scenes of complete destruction in Gaza are horrific and reveal an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Entire neighborhoods have been razed to the ground along with their residents. 60% of housing units and more than 300 education facilities were destroyed. Residents stand in long lines hoping to get a piece of bread or a few drops of water as humanitarian aid is prevented from reaching Gaza. The limited assistance that does arrive is a mere drop in the ocean compared to the overwhelming needs. Even the wounded and the sick have been deprived of their right to health care, as Israel has deliberately and unacceptably targeted hospitals and health facilities, compelling their evacuation. Concurrently, there have been deliberate disruptions to fuel and medical supplies. In some, these actions have caused the health sector to entirely collapse. Children's limbs were amputated without anesthesia. Premature infants were removed from incubators, and patients in intensive care units have died, transforming health facilities into graves. Furthermore, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced to relocate from northern and to southern Gaza amid extremely difficult conditions and dangerous. This occurred despite the absence of any safe havens in the Strip, and this painful scene evoked memories of the 1948 Nakba. The fact that nearly 80% of the people in Gaza are displaced since the beginning of the offensive, with more than 1 million people taking refuge in UNRWA facilities, demonstrates the magnitude of the catastrophe, especially in light of the significant lack of humanitarian aid. The UAE reaffirms in the strongest terms its condemnation of Israel's collective punishment policies against the Palestinian people, as well as the attempts to displace the Palestinians, which we categorically reject. The future and the governance of Gaza must remain in the hands of the Palestinian people. Any presumptions or plans that seek to separate the Gaza Strip from the State of Palestine are unacceptable. We also stress the need for the international community to adopt unified rules condemning violations of international humanitarian law. This includes the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, civilian objects, and UN facilities. Applying double standards across these matters causes chaos and undermines our international order that must remain based on the respect of international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, following weeks of dangerous escalation, The UAE believes that the truce reached by the two parties last week represents a sign of hope, especially given that it included a 4-day cessation of hostilities, which was extended for 2 additional days, as well as a limited amount of aid delivery and the exchange of Palestinian prisoners and Israeli hostages. This includes scaling up humanitarian aid and agreeing on further extensions to allow sufficient time and space for the implementation of critical humanitarian activities, such as reaching thousands of people trapped under the rubble simultaneously. Ongoing efforts must persist in reaching an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We express our appreciation to Qatar, Egypt, and the United States for their tireless efforts to reach this agreement and support its implementation. We value their diplomatic efforts in addressing one of the most difficult crises in the history of our region. We also stress the importance of ensuring the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2712, which demands all parties to respect their obligations under international law and calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and the unconditional release of detainees. In this context, we underline the relevance of the Secretary General's briefing today and stress the importance of introducing proper monitoring to ensure the effective implementation of this resolution. It is also necessary to improve mechanisms for the safe, permanent, and unhindered access of aid into Gaza in a sustained manner and at sufficient scale. Ensuring the distribution of aid to all those in need without restriction or delay. We commend here the efforts of Egypt in facilitating aid access through the Rafah crossing and allowing the sick, injured, hostages, and other civilians to exit Gaza. For its part, the United Arab Emirates continues to implement its humanitarian efforts to alleviate the crisis in Gaza. A few days ago, we began delivering the necessary materials to establish a field hospital in the Gaza Strip under the supervision of a UAE medical team. We welcomed groups of children from Gaza to UAE hospitals. This is part of our initiative to host 1,000 children and their families to receive the necessary medical attention. In addition, we receive 1,000 cancer patients. Additionally, we have announced contributions to UNRWA and launched a public campaign to support those affected in Gaza. The campaign has raised more than 16,000 tons of relief materials so far that were delivered to the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, as the world is focused on the catastrophic situation in the Gaza Strip, we must not overlook the worrying conditions in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. These areas have been facing mounting Israeli aggression since the beginning of this year, resulting in the killing of 400 Palestinians in this year alone. Repeated incursions into Al-Aqsa Mosque by extremist groups under the protection of Israeli authorities have become more frequent. Settler violence has also reached unprecedented levels, manifesting in increasingly serious and severe forms while Israel has bombed refugee camps in Jenin and Nablus. Concurrently, Israel continues to build and expand its settlement activities, further dividing Palestinian land and violating international law and Security Council resolutions. These illegal practices must stop now. The ongoing turmoil cannot endure additional provocative measures or violence and hate speech. The security of both peoples as well as the region is at stake. Mr. President, the recent events have demonstrated the need for the international community to stop merely managing this conflict. Instead, we must work to revive hope for the possibility of a just, lasting, and comprehensive political solution to the Palestinian issue. Moving forward, we must begin thinking on ways to create a suitable environment for serious negotiations based on the agreed references to achieve the two-state solution, so that these steps may begin as soon as a ceasefire is reached. We underscore that achieving sustainable peace will not be possible without ending the Israeli occupation of all Palestinian and Arab territories and establishing an independent Palestinian state on the borders of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side with Israel in security, peace, and mutual recognition. Meanwhile, we must persist in our efforts to prevent the region from sliding into war, which would have resounding repercussions affecting the entire world. Therefore, the ongoing skirmishes in southern Lebanon, the Syrian Golan, and the Red Sea must end. We cannot allow our region to remain hostage to crises and conflicts. Our people deserve to live in security and stability. Our youth aspire for a better future, and in the UAE, we are determined to strive for that. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Al-Marha for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Thomas Guibert, State Secretary of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Excellencies, I would like to thank you for facilitating this meeting, attended by many ministers and representatives of countries affected by the hostilities in the Middle East. Their participation testifies to the international community's determination to find a solution to this crisis. Because time is running out. As the Secretary General and Special Coordinator Tor Vennesland, who I warmly thank for their presentations, have just said, the situation on the ground is serious. By adopting Resolution 2712, the Council opened a breach in the bloody dynamic of this conflict. This resolution demands, and I quote, that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians. At the same time, as it recognizes Israel's right to ensure its defense and security, Switzerland recalls that respect for international humanitarian law is imperative. This Council has the duty to ensure that this law and human rights are respected by all parties to the conflict. This law protects all civilians, including the wounded and sick, humanitarian and medical personnel, and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and UNRWA schools. Civilians have paid the heaviest price since the outbreak of hostilities. The lives of more than 1,000 of them were snuffed out by Hamas during the acts of terror it perpetrated on the 7th of October in Israel, which Switzerland strongly condemned. A large number of hostages remain captive in Gaza. We welcome the releases that have taken place through the mediation of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, and thanks to the important role of neutral intermediary played by the ICRC. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held in Gaza. Of the thousands of civilians killed in Gaza, more than a third are children. Switzerland calls for the extension of the humanitarian pause due to end tomorrow morning. The catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip demands it. We welcome the additional aid delivered over the past week, including fuel. But it is still far from enough. We must insist that humanitarian aid be delivered unhindered and without preconditions to civilian populations in need throughout the Gaza Strip. To this end, we call for every effort to be made to allow humanitarian access through all crossing points, including for commercial goods. Switzerland would like to thank the Secretary-General in advance for the proposals that he intends to submit for the practical implementation of Resolution 2712. We are ready to engage constructively to find a new consensus within this Council, while bearing in mind the need to pursue a political solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Mr. President, throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, in Gaza and in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the situation continues to deteriorate. In the West Bank, increased settler violence has led to the forced displacement of entire communities. Switzerland recalls Israel's obligations under international law, including the obligation to protect the civilian population. In the context of operations by Israeli security forces, the use of force must in particular meet the criterion of proportionality and respect the rights of every individual to life and security of person. Investigations must be conducted into all violations of international law committed in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, so that the perpetrators can be brought to justice. Finally, it is essential to find a comprehensive political solution to the conflict. In this process, it is important to pay attention to the voices and contributions of Palestinian and Israeli women who want to build peace. This Council must take concrete steps towards a two-state solution, which is the only possible foundation for peace and stability in the region. We must help to rebuild this foundation for two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Thank you.
I
thank His Excellency Mr. Guibert for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Mavis Nkansa Boadu, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking China for its leadership in the Council this month and convening this meeting on the Middle East peace process at high level, reflecting the exigencies of the moment. Ghana thanks the Secretary General for his statements, especially the updates on the implementation of Resolution 2712 and the options to effectively monitor the implementation of the demands of the Council in the resolution. We also thank Special Coordinator Wang for his briefing on the situation on the ground. We have also taken note of statements by the representatives of Israel and Palestine. Ghana appreciates the complexity and horrors of the tragedy that has unfolded in the region since 7 October, as well as the frustration of both sides. Now, however, it is time to embrace the overwhelming call of the international communities for reconciliation and for peace and security for the people of the region. The tears, suffering, and death on both sides must end. Mr. President, over the past 54 days, the world's focus and attention has been fixated on the Middle East, and in particular southern Israel and the Gaza Strip. The brutal and horrific attacks of Hamas and other armed actors against Israel on October 7th, the loss of 1,200 Israeli lives, and the abduction of over 200 Israeli and foreign nationals as hostages marks an escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not seen in the recent years. The Israeli military response, which has led to the reported killings of more than 14,000 Palestinians, has compounded the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip with dire consequences. We are saddened by the turn of events and the impact the hostilities ensued has caused on both sides, especially to women and children, as well as the United Nations and other humanitarian relief workers. We reiterate our heartfelt condolences to the affected families and friends of all those whose promise for tomorrow for the future has been ruined by the brutality of the war. We are heartened by the humanitarian pause mediated by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States between the parties on 22nd November, which has so far led to the release of several Palestinian prisoners and Israeli and foreign hostages. We welcome the extension of the deal for an additional 2 days ending today. We appeal to Israel and Hamas to extend the humanitarian pause for a repeated 2 days period on the basis of a regional arrangement which requires Hamas to also release a number of hostages. This is necessary to continue to save lives and to enable those mediating the conflict to build confidence with further mutual measures. We note the need for additional humanitarian aid, even though the deal has significantly increased the number of trucks entering Gaza through the Rafah border crossing. The supply of food, medicines, and fuel is an important factor to prevent the population of Gaza from being pushed into an unimaginable public health catastrophe. We therefore support practical arrangements that can increase supplies through different border crossing and restore a minimum level of public health capacity. We reiterate our demand that UNRWA's facility, including storage facility, should be separated from the conflict and strongly appeal for a positive response by donors to the flash appeals of UNRWA and OCHA. We believe that the continuing efforts of this Council to preserve lives should hinge first on how we can ensure that those not consumed by the conflict are provided support to live. We emphasize the protection of civilians. It's a cardinal responsibility of the Council, which requires a strong reminder to the parties of the obligations to respect international humanitarian law and protect civilian and civilian infrastructure, which are non-negotiable principles that preserve our common humanity. Mr. President, events over the past days reminds us of the consequences of elusive peace in the Middle East in the last 75 years. We also contemplate a Gaza after tomorrow. We cannot overlook the totality of peace required in Palestine. We demand of the parties their full commitment to seek the narrow and difficult path for a renewed and constructive dialogue on the political horizon. Ghana, like many others, does not see an alternative to the two-state solution. Whilst the unacceptable settlement-related activities or the unending cycle of violent clashes, particularly in the West Bank, or the arbitrary arrest and detention of Palestinians constitute obstacles on the way forward, they should not be hindrances too difficult to overcome for the cause of peace. The cost of war and the deterioration in the security situation in Palestine portends greater danger for the Middle East region and beyond. This is a cost none of us should be willing to incur. We must therefore spare no effort to de-escalate the conflict and prevent its spread beyond its confines. In this regard, we urge all countries with mediating influence to come together to abate the tension in the region. This also requires that we act to stop the exchange of fire across the blue lines, including around the contested Shaba Farms area, as well as help the cessation of maritime seizures of Israel-owned and managed cargo ships in the Red Sea and off the Eden coast. The persistent launch of drones and missiles from neighboring countries towards Israel amidst the Israel-Hamas war is also provocative and must stop. These incidents must, amongst others, put the lives of United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon members at risk and present a direct threat to the peace and stability of all the countries in the region. We reiterate the important stabilization role of the UNIFIL and UNDOF and appeal to all parties and countries in the region to exercise extreme restraint in and rein in the activities of all armed groups operating from within their territories. Mr. President, the stress by the humanitarian and security situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly in the Gaza Strip, where around 1.2 million people, over 80% of the population, have been displaced, with the majority of them being women and children. This Council has not seen a shortage of initiatives to find consensus beyond the adoption of Resolution 2712. Like many Council members, Ghana believes that the increasing mistrust between Israel and Palestine makes it imperative for this Council to enhance its action to support direct engagement by the parties in a manner that would enable the Palestinian people to exercise their rights to a homeland whilst ensuring the state of its security. Regrettably, the Middle East Quartet, which had served as the unifying shepherd for the peace process, has not been able to act in recent time. Cognizant of the need for a horizon, we strongly encourage the Council to consider appointing a rapporteur from amongst its members in accordance with provisional rules of procedure to unify the position of the Council on how to further proceed with a two-stage solution. We must do so mindful of the need for a comprehensive and sustained effort to address the root cause of the conflict. Whilst we therefore regret the Middle East region has witnessed some of the worst forms of violent clashes in recent times, the overwhelming desire around the world for peace in the region, especially in the occupied Palestinian territories, should galvanize us to seek some practical steps now. Tomorrow may be too late to reverse the trends of instability that are taking root in the region. We therefore urge a renewed support by the international community for the two-stage solution to achieve a just, lasting, and comprehensive solution for the Palestinian question on the basis of the 1967 lines with Jerusalem as the shared capital. In closing, I renew Ghana's commitment to support efforts towards lasting peace in the Middle East region and underscore the need for cooperation and a unified action by all of us. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Nkansa Boadu for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Tsukasa Uemura, Special Envoy of the Middle East Peace of Japan.
Mr. President, thank you for calling this important meeting. My appreciation also goes to the Secretary General and to the UN Special Coordinator. Today, it is the 46th anniversary of International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian people. I have been engaged in this Middle East for 4 decades. A lot of my friends are in Palestine, including in the Gaza Strip, in the Arab countries, and as well as in Israel. I feel indescribable grief, but nothing deprives me of hope towards the future. I'm convinced that sadness and hope are shared. The Middle East peace should be built on this common ground. Japan's position on this current situation has been repeatedly explained in this chamber. Thus, I'd like to focus on what we should share as an old friend of this region, not on what we differ. I'm a person who have devoted my whole career to this complex but fascinating region. Despite many challenges and difficulties, this region holds great potential to realize coexistence and co-prosperity. Mr. President, a true peace can be achieved only through dialogue based on mutual trust, not by violence. Japan has consistently supported a two-state solution to be achieved through negotiations. Our approach to a two-state solution has been based on 3 pillars. That is, political dialogue, confidence building, and economic assistance to the Palestinian people. My colleagues and I have worked very hard and strongly promoted important policies such as the agricultural project in Ariha in Jericho and the Conference on Cooperation among East Asian Countries for Palestinian Development, we call CPAD. Japan continues to work together with all parties for the peace and prosperity of this region. Mr. President, the current suffering of children, women, and the elderly breaks our hearts. The news of released hostages makes us relieved, but the remaining hostages must be released immediately without condition. I also emphasize that the humanitarian situation in Palestine is still deteriorating. We need to stop further deterioration. All parties must act faithfully based on the Security Council resolution recently adopted. All parties must comply with international law, including international humanitarian law. The ongoing pause and its momentum must lead to hope for the future. The current conflict since October 7 must not block the path to peace in the Middle East. The international community should continue to make utmost efforts to bring about the peaceful coexistence between the two sides. Mr. President, Japan's Foreign Minister, Ms. Yoko Kamikawa, issued a message for this Solidarity Day. We need lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. There is no solution other than the peaceful coexistence of Israel and Palestine. Finally, I'd like to remind an important value for Japanese as well as for peoples in the Middle East. That is, the importance of moderation. In Arabic, I say, Khairul Ulum al-Satha. It means in even difficult situations, go in the middle is the best way. This is also an important virtue advocated by Confucius, Aristotle, and many philosophers around the world. There is something common running around all of us in a fundamental way of life. Japan is, in good times and bad times, an escort runner for Palestine, Israel, and all the people and the peoples living in the Middle East. We are very much prepared to be a part of any international effort to make a good future, better future in this region. Thank you very much.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I commend China on the initiative of this open meeting and for its leadership throughout this month of November. I thank the Secretary General for the update on the situation in the war between Israel and Hamas. We welcome, as a return of humanity, the agreement that allowed for the truce that began on Friday and the release of several Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners. This extremely emotional moment of respite must be seized upon to save lives, to provide the necessary assistance to those people that need it, and to put in place the conditions for a definitive cessation of hostilities. This is a window of hope to give effect to Resolution 2712, which was adopted by this Council on the 15th of November, as well as the resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly. We welcome the combined efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States that helped achieve this pause. This truce must be sustained to allow for a return to international humanitarian law in the ruins of Gaza and the distress of its population. The lethal violence unleashed by Hamas's barbaric attacks on the 7th of October has reached an unbearable level. The time has come to stop counting the dead in the tens of thousands. It's time to stop the bleeding of children killed in their thousands. The time has come to put an end to the bloodbath in Gaza and the chaos for the civilian population. Once again, Gabon calls upon all parties to show restraint and to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and for accountability for grave violations of international law. We will continue to repeat that the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must be political and diplomatic through dialogue and good faith negotiations and ensuring respect for the legitimate concerns of each of the parties. Gabon reiterates its firm condemnation of all indiscriminate lethal violence and calls for the unconditional release of all of the hostages. We reiterate our call for unfettered, safe and sustained access for the delivery and distribution of essential goods and services for the millions of people in need. To conclude, Mr. President, I reiterate Gabon's commitment to the two-state solution, two states coexisting peacefully on the basis of internationally recognized borders. It is more than ever time to put this solution into practice. To achieve that, dialogue and negotiation are the essential channels with a central role played by the United Nations. Thank you.
Okay.
I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me thank the Secretary General for his remarks and the Special Coordinator for his briefing. The key fact and the key word of these days are the holding humanitarian truce. It has been 6 days without hostilities, 6 days without the deafening noise of war and its deadly consequences, 6 days without the terrifying sirens announcing missiles flying over Israel, and most importantly, 6 days without victims. Diplomacy has made headway, humanity has prevailed, and some hope has been restored. The truce is holding and extending, and we see it as a testimony of a desire for peace. The continued release of the hostages is very positive, is very welcome, but so is also the relief for the Palestinians in Gaza. We commend Qatar, Egypt, and the United States for their efforts and urge them to continue until all hostages are united with their families. We are encouraged to notice that some key elements of the Security Council Resolution 2712 that Albania supported are being implemented, and we call for the resolution to be fully implemented. We welcome, in this context, the considerable increase of the volume of humanitarian aid to Gaza, including fuel and cooking gas. But way more is needed and way more needs to be done. Colleagues, the horrific events of the 7th of October, the deliberate massacre of civilians and abduction, cannot be forgotten. Hamas has carefully planned and knowingly executed the worst. Nothing can or will ever justify terror, and nothing can or will ever justify taking civilian hostages, including babies, children, and elderly, and using them for political purposes. It is unfortunate that 7 weeks after the events, the Council has not been able to issue a condemnation of the unacceptable and the unforgivable. Mr. President, in this conflict, as in every conflict, civilians have paid an unprecedented human heavy toll, especially women and children, always the most affected. This is intolerable and must stop. We recall that the protection of civilians must be the primary concern in every conflict, and international law must be fully observed. And this applies also to the civilian infrastructure. WHO has raised alarms about the rise in outbreaks of infectious diseases in Gaza. Without medicine, without routine vaccination activities, without proper access to safe water and hygiene, and without sufficient food, disease could kill way more people than the hostilities. This must be quickly reversed. Let's not forget that while the attention is focused in Gaza, innocent civilians, including children, are also dying in the West Bank. We expect Israel to commit the same efforts and ingenuity to saving innocent Palestinian lives as it does in its efforts to decimating and eliminating Hamas. Because for as long as the Palestinians will see the war against Hamas as a collective punishment where they end up being the first victims, the prospects of long-lasting peace will be remote and shaky, if anything. Mr. President, oppressive and brutal regimes are never liked. They are only feared. Hamas rule in Gaza is no exception. During 18 years of Hamas rule, the Gaza Strip has been besieged, impoverished, underdeveloped, left without clear perspective. And as we discover now, the only real investment of Hamas in Gaza are the tunnels, not for the population, but only and exclusively for Hamas and its warmongering policies. I hope that the people of Gaza will come to understand that while Hamas is trying to sell them terror as a false victory, it will never be able to do more than dragging them into war with Israel. However justified their frustration for the lack of progress and their fatigue with never seeing their dreams come true are, peaceful Palestinians should not be fooled to believe that Hamas will give them the state they need and deserve, the future they want and aspire to. Instead of joining the Palestinian Authority, the legitimate representatives of Palestinian people, and seek a viable and long-lasting solution through political means only, Hamas seeks the destruction of the State of Israel. Such policy will never see the end of the tunnel. It risks staying buried underground or dying under the rubble, killing at the same time the hopes of Palestinians for a normal life and a decent future. This is why, while the urgency of the day is, and rightly so, to save lives and bring humanitarian need up to scale and for everyone in need, it is crucial to think and work for the day after the current conflict is over. There is no alternative. Palestinians need and deserve their state, and Israel needs and must have its security. These are not mutually excluding. On the contrary, they are mutually feeding and mutually reassuring. Mr. President, the Palestinian question cannot remain the modern Sisyphean task. It must be set as soon as possible on the right path, that of a serious political process where there is talk and walk for peace, for a viable, secure and free Palestinian state, as well as security, cooperation, progress and dignity for all, Israelis and Palestinians alike. If not, we will fail again, and the nightmare of today will end up being the prelude of tomorrow. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania, and I give the floor to Malta.
Thank you, President. I begin by thanking the Secretary General for his briefing on the implementation of Resolution 2712. The full implementation of this resolution remains paramount. I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his important briefing on the situation on the ground. Malta commends the mediation efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, which have led to the first humanitarian truce, the gradual release of hostages from Gaza, and the release of detained Palestinian women and children from Israeli prisons. The extension of this truce for an additional 2 days was also a welcome development. We urge the parties to continue to build on these steps. As a first measure, the truce must continue to be extended. A genuine commitment towards a ceasefire and a lasting political solution is also needed as a matter of urgency. We also commend the ICRC for its efforts in facilitating the transfer of hostages and detainees. We call for them to be allowed access to the remaining hostages. Malta reiterates its strong condemnation of the terror attacks by Hamas against Israel and her people on 7 October. We once again call for the release of all remaining hostages safely and unconditionally. At the same time, the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is untenable. Thousands of civilians, many of whom are women and children, have been killed. The population continues to suffer from colossal difficulties and hardships regarding healthcare, food security, shelter, and sanitation. A large number of journalists have also lost their lives. Meanwhile, countless children continue to live in increased anguish and deprivation. They are disproportionately affected by this conflict and the lack of necessities. The long-term impact that violence will have on their mental health cannot be ignored. The WHO's statement that more people will die due to rising rates of disease is gravely concerning, and immediate action is needed to prevent this scenario. The truth we have seen in these past days has made clear that a cessation of hostilities is the only way to ensure civilians are protected and continue to receive humanitarian support. The scaling up and distribution of humanitarian aid can only take place under such conditions. We urgently call on all parties to ensure the protection of civilians and aid workers in compliance with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. In this light, we also recognize UNRWA's work, which has continued to take place under extremely dangerous circumstances. We convey our sincerest condolences for the over 100 UNRWA staff who have been killed in this conflict. We cannot afford to lose more lives. We cannot return to further bloodshed and insecurity. It is in this spirit that Malta echoes the Secretary General's call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. President, while all eyes are on Gaza, the West Bank is also suffering unprecedented escalations. Since 7th October, there has been a sharp increase in the killing, violence, and forced displacement suffered by Palestinians through settler violence and hundreds of arrests. Malta underlines Israel's obligations to abide by international law and ensure the protection of the Palestinian population against all acts or threats of violence. We reiterate that settlements are illegal under international law and an obstacle to peace. We call on parties to urge de-escalation and exercise the utmost restraint. Avoiding a regional conflagration is of utmost importance and must be avoided at all costs. We also call on the parties to show restraint and de-escalation along the blue line. The implementation of Resolution 1701 remains key. It is also imperative that we consider a credible foundation for future peace. Malta thus reaffirms its commitment to a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and the internationally agreed parameters. Within this dire context, and particularly today, on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, it remains clear that this is the only viable path to achieving peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta. Now I give the floor to Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, President. Like other delegations, we welcome the senior officials present in this meeting, and we thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for their briefings. Above all, we reiterate Ecuador's gratitude for their work and that of all of the United Nations personnel. We also express our condolences for the 111 staff members who have lost their life over recent weeks because of this conflict. Ecuador has been clear in expressing its robust and unequivocal condemnation of the unjustifiable terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, and in expressing its condolences to the families of the victims of these heinous acts and its solidarity with the people of Israel. There is no possible justification for attacking innocent civilians. This is also the opportunity for all those hostages taken by Hamas to be immediately released with no conditions. Hamas's terrorist attacks do not represent the Palestinian people, nor their inalienable right to self-determination, nor their legitimate aspirations to live in security, liberty, justice, opportunities, and dignity. These weeks have caused thousands of painful and unacceptable deaths among innocent civilians, including Palestinian women and children. Ecuador stands in full solidarity also with their families and with the Palestinian people. President, Israel has the right to defend its population, and in doing that it must uphold the principles of international law and international humanitarian law. There is no justification for causing pain and death amongst innocent civilians, and no efforts must be spared in avoiding that. The recent pause in hostilities is valuable. This has allowed for the release of dozens of hostages taken by Hamas, particularly the most vulnerable, as well as the delivery of humanitarian aid, which is urgently needed by the civilian population in Gaza. It has also allowed for the release of dozens of Palestinians held in Israel. This is a hopeful first step towards peace, and we call upon the parties to seek its extension insofar as is possible. Every day without hostilities is a further opportunity to allow people to speak and no longer weapons. It contributes to avoiding the expansion of the conflict to other areas and gives civilians a breathing space, as well as to the international community, which is following the topic so closely. President, Excellencies, the position of my country on this topic and others is based upon the principles of international law. We believe that the resolutions of the Security Council must always be upheld. The implementation of Resolution 2712 is important to alleviate the conditions facing the civilians in Gaza, in particular women and children, who make up the majority of the victims. It is indispensable to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid, including medicine, fuel, water and food, to all those who need it, in appropriate quantities and at appropriate rate. To this end, we deem an immediate, lasting and fully upheld humanitarian ceasefire to be crucial. In this regard, we must fulfill the provisions of Resolution 2334. The situation in the West Bank is worrisome, as is the increase in violence since the 7th of October and the continued settlement activities. Any measure which undermines the viability of the two-state solution contributes to perpetuating the conflict and does not improve security. All protagonists must show restraint, must avoid exacerbating tension and prevent expansion of the violence to other areas, including the border between Israel and Lebanon. The almost 8 decades of conflict, the thousands upon thousands of deaths, and the immeasurable pain and suffering of whole generations are the clearest evidence that violence is not the solution. It is time to halt the logic of seeking guilty parties and rather focus once and for all on achieving a permanent resolution to this question. Finally, President, I reiterate what Ecuador has said on numerous occasions before this Council, the General Assembly and elsewhere. The only way of bringing an end to this conflict is through a peaceful, negotiated, definitive and just solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, upon the basis of the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador. Now I give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mozambique warmly commends China's presidency for convening this high-level briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his effort in keeping a momentum in the agenda for peace over the world, particularly the conflicts in the Middle East. We also extend our thanks to Mr. Tor Wennesland for the insightful briefing on the Middle East peace process. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Palestine is of the utmost concern and needs to be addressed effectively and demands urgent action. Mozambique welcomes the new developments that culminated with the 4-day truce, which was extended for 2 more days, allowing critical humanitarian assistance to reach the most vulnerable and innocent recipients of this conflict. Regrettably, the situation is still worrying, and we are all concerned on what will happen in the following hours, given that the humanitarian pause expires today. We urge all involved parties to persist in discussions and apply their wisdom in finding enduring resolution for peace and security between the two parties. Both Israelis and Palestinians should assess the recent developments, particularly the humanitarian pause, as a starting point to a more consistent and lasting solution which brings the war to an end. We believe the truce was fundamental in mobilizing initiatives for humanitarian assistance, particularly the protection of the civilians and saving lives in the Gaza Strip. Mozambique sees this opportunity to convey her gratitude to the United Nations staff and to the mediators such as Egypt, Qatar, and the United States involved in this endeavor. Their unwavering efforts during this difficult period have played a crucial role in mitigating the hardships faced by civilians. This reminds us all that the protection of civilians in conflicted situations is a priority and mandatory in accordance with the international human rights and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the situation on the ground warrants for a long humanitarian pause or agreed compromise to ensure that all those in a dire situation have access to basic needs such as water, electricity, food, and medicine. We are of the view that a de-escalation of the conflict will allow for the free mobility of aid workers and relaunch of dialogue between parties in conflict. In this context, Mozambique associates itself with the parties for an urgent implementation of Resolution 2712. It is necessary to facilitate the delivery of critical goods and services necessary for the health, survival, and protection of civilians, especially the most vulnerable children, as well for the imperative release of hostages. Therefore, there is an urgency to scale up and improve the delivery of critical and timely humanitarian assistance into Gaza through the relevant UN channels. Mr. President, because of the ongoing conflict, Mozambique foresees a challenging reconstruction process of infrastructure, recovery of economic functionality, and building trust between Palestine and Israel. In our view, the two-state solution still remains relevant and indispensable for lasting peace and harmony in the region. This requires both parties in conflict and the UN wider family to redouble their efforts to achieve this desirable goal in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 242 and 2334. Therefore, the Security Council and the international community at large have a determinant role to play in containing and bringing this conflict to an end. Mr. President, to conclude, we urge the parties to pursue the path of dialogue, working together constructively towards peace and respecting the principle of two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique. Now I give the floor to France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I thank the Secretary General and Mr. Venesland for their briefings. France once again commends the engagement on the ground of the United Nations, UNRWA personnel, and that of all those humanitarian workers who are doing such remarkable work. France also welcomes the extension of the truce and thanks Qatar, Egypt, the United States, and the ICRC for their efforts. This truce must become permanent, and must lead to a ceasefire. We warmly welcome the release of three French children who had been taken hostage and that of all the other hostages. All hostages must immediately be released with no conditions. France reiterates its condemnation of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas and other terrorist groups against Israel on the 7th of October. The Security Council must condemn these unambiguously and without further delay. Israel has the right to defend itself and the duty to do this whilst fully upholding international humanitarian law. Civilian populations and infrastructure must be protected. The current truce has allowed for increased aid delivery into Gaza, including in the north. This progress is positive, but this aid is not sufficient. Other crossing points must be opened. France has already deployed over 100 tons of freight and provided 100 million euros since the 7th of October, including 54 for UNRWA. We are also ensuring follow-up on the International Humanitarian Conference on the 9th of October in Paris. The Dixmude hospital ship yesterday began treating Palestinian wounded, along with medical support coordinated by Egypt, whose action on this matter I also command. France has called for the immediate implementation of Resolution 2712. President, France condemns the violence in the West Bank by settlers against Palestinians. This has claimed the lives of numerous Palestinian civilians and the forced departure of several communities in Zone C. France calls upon the Israeli authorities to immediately halt this violence. We also have a duty to prevent a regional escalation. France is fully engaged to avoid the conflict spilling over, and we warn those who wish to benefit from the situation. The security of the blue helmets of UNIFIL, UNDOF and UNTSO must be ensured, and we are concerned regarding recent firing against UNIFIL. President, to bring an end to the cycles of violence, there must be an immediate relaunch of a credible and serious peace process so as to allow the Palestinians and Israelis to live side by side in peace and security. Further procrastination would undoubtedly result in a resumption and exacerbation of violence. The two-state solution, with indispensable security guarantees for Israel and a state for the Palestinians, is the only viable solution. France is mobilized to achieve this. The President of the Republic met the IOC and Arab League group for Gaza on the 27th of November in Paris and is continuing discussions with his counterparts in the region. France will continue to work towards the achievement of these objectives, and so that the Council can speak with one voice to this end. Thank you.
I thank France for the statement. Now I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we're grateful to the Chinese presidency for holding today's meeting. We highly appreciate the contribution of Beijing to multilateral efforts to resolve the situation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict zone. For more than 2 months in the Middle East, a conflict of biblical proportions has been raging. It would be no exaggeration to say that it has become one of the most lethal regional conflicts in recent decades. The statistics of casualties and victims are setting monstrous records. In less than 2 months' time, 1,200 Israelis and 15,000 civilian Palestinians have died, half of which are children, an unprecedented number of residents of Gaza since 1948. 1.6 million people have become internally displaced persons. More than 111 staff members of UN humanitarian agencies have died. We express condolences to all of the dead and wounded civilians in Israel and Palestine, and also the families of humanitarian workers who have died. We are deeply grateful to all of the humanitarian workers who every hour risk their lives to continue courageously carrying out their duty on the ground. As bitter as it may be to acknowledge, I'll be frank, their contribution to mitigating the consequences of this escalation for ordinary people is much greater than the one that the Security Council of the United Nations has managed to achieve over this time. And now is the time to ask ourselves how that could have happened. In response to the correct calls we've heard today for unity of the Council, I would directly like to touch upon a number of awkward issues for our Western colleagues that are fundamentally important for understanding the current situation. The first of which is the blatant double standards of Western delegations vis-à-vis the Palestinian people. And there are several blatant examples. How many times have Western delegations requested Security Council meetings on Ukraine? The answer is at least twice a month. The USA and Albania do everything they can to express concern over the political aspects of the crisis, and France and Ecuador are positioning themselves as fighters for overcoming its humanitarian consequences. How many times have these delegations requested Security Council meetings on the Middle East? 0. Colleagues, why are you being so timid? Or is it that the fate of the Palestinian population is much less interesting for you from a domestic political perspective in your capitals? These same double standards are something that we've already seen laid bare in the situation of the crisis of migration to the European Union, when Ukrainian refugees are given all sorts of benefits and preferences on the basis of the fact that they are allegedly used to that way of life at home, and refugees from Africa and the countries of the Middle East are kept in camps in inhumane conditions. Incidentally, yesterday in Ukraine, a serious scandal broke out after an advisor to the office of the President of Ukraine, Sergei Lyshenko, published a video of him from a nightclub in Kiev jam-packed with dancing young people. Ukrainians have been outraged by this from the point of view of the total mobilization going on in parallel, but I want to ask you about something else. After 2 years of our special military operation in Kiev, nightclubs are still operating and are extremely popular, but how many entertainment facilities are operating in Gaza? In truth, even asking the question is abominable in light of the destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, food manufacturers, and civilian infrastructure in general. The residents of Gaza have nowhere to go to relax at this point. And my next question relates to children. Our Western colleagues express such hypocritical concern in front of the cameras about Ukrainian children, but they don't hesitate to besmirch Russia by circulating absolutely absurd and repellent rumors about their abduction. And all of this is while Russia is doing everything it can to protect children from the consequences of the Western-inspired Ukrainian crisis. What about Palestinian children? Secretary General Guterres has said that Gaza has become a graveyard for children. Those words would force any normal person to shudder. In the space of a month alone of the escalation in Gaza, more children died than in all conflicts in the last few years taken together. Every day in the enclave, dozens, if not hundreds of children die and are maimed. IDF strikes are hitting schools and hospitals. The basic rights of the child to life and health are being trampled. Now, distinguished Western colleagues, where are your appeals to the ICC for arrest warrants? Where are your efforts to create all sorts of investigative commissions and tribunals? Another telling subject is the situation of women. Western delegations pontificate at every opportunity about equality and demand that in literally every Security Council product we include the mantra about the need to ensure significant participation of women in political decision-making processes. They demand that the gender aspect be taken into account even in subjects that objectively have nothing to do with it, such as nuclear disarmament. Which women are you worried about? Judging by everything, it's clearly not Palestinian women. They have had even their most fundamental right taken away from them, the right to life and security. We all heard the chilling briefings of the executive directors of UN Women, Sima Bahous, and the UN Population Fund, Natalia Kanem, at the last briefing about the suffering of women in Gaza. And this includes types of suffering that, due to physiological differences, men don't have to deal with. Palestinian women in the enclave have to give birth in unsanitary conditions. Under bombings, they are subjected to major surgery without anesthetics and medicines. Western delegations in the Council prefer to shamefully keep quiet about this. Which of you then are supporters of the women, peace and security agenda? We only see hypocrites and unprincipled opportunists who, if required by political expediency, will turn a blind eye to any crimes and, on the contrary, will find them where they don't exist. Distinguished colleagues, Over these weeks, one extremely unseemly fact has become clear. For the West, Palestinians are second-class people, defending the interest of which they simply have no interest in doing. This is the main cause of the problems that this Council has faced when coming up with decisions. For almost 2 months, the international community, humanitarian agencies, NGOs, and ordinary citizens have been calling on the Council to demand that the parties immediately cease fire. Russia has been talking about this from the very beginning of the escalation. We first, back on the 16th of October, proposed to the Council a draft resolution saying so, and a few days later we proposed a second one. But this appeal has still not been acted upon. And yet, a sustainable ceasefire is not just a moral imperative, it is the only way of guaranteeing an effective humanitarian response, which simply cannot be carried out in the conditions of hostilities. The maximum that the Council has been able to bring forth over this entire time is the toothless Resolution 2712 about humanitarian pauses without any mechanism for monitoring its implementation. It's no surprise that it's not being implemented. Its initial positive message was, through the efforts of the USA, extremely watered down and does not contain a demand for a ceasefire, nor does it provide for practical measures to ensure broad and unfettered access to those in need and the provision of assistance to the suffering. It also left out the forceful raids of Israel on the West Bank and arbitrary airstrikes on Syria, as well as the rise in tensions on the Blue Line with Lebanon, which could lead to a further expansion of the crisis in the Middle East region. Representatives of the Israeli leadership, unfortunately, made full use of the US-provoked division in the Council and did not delay in calling that resolution meaningless, declaring their intentions to ignore it and continue their clearing of the Gaza Strip, after which there was further bombing of schools, hospitals, mosques, churches, and UNRWA facilities. Colleagues, you all understand very well that this is an open violation of a Security Council resolution and Article 25 of the UN Charter. However, we've not heard a word of condemnation from you, and yet you would not have skimped on this in other country situations. This is a further demonstration of your blatant double standards. Of course, we cannot help but be pleased that as a result of the recent humanitarian pause and the exchange of hostages, people's lives have been saved. But these steps were the result of an agreement by players in the region and don't have anything to do with the aforementioned resolution of the Security Council. And that means that although this arrangement is providing a glimmer of hope, it is not sustainable nor comprehensive in nature. And in particular, it has not allowed Palestinians to return to the north of the enclave, and it does not cover Syria and Lebanon. And therefore, the main issue remains what awaits the long-suffering Gaza and other occupied Palestinian territories tomorrow. There is a high risk that in the absence of a precise, verifiable decision by the Security Council on a ceasefire, this short respite will be followed by a new cycle of violence, and Gazans that during the pause received assistance will die under the further shelling. The extreme likelihood of this most negative scenario is also indicated by the unambiguous statements of representatives of the Israeli leadership about their plans to continue after the end of the humanitarian pause their intensive clearing of the Gaza Strip. Therefore, it's important that humanitarian pauses and addressing the acute humanitarian issues facing the Gaza Strip become a prologue to a ceasefire rather than a de facto green light for Israel to continue the bloodshed in Gaza. There is one answer for the UN Security Council to adopt decisive measures in this regard that, unlike any bilateral arrangements, ensure a mechanism for international monitoring. As a first step, we expect that the Secretary-General, as stipulated in Resolution 2712, will as soon as possible present proposals on concrete options for organizing a mechanism for monitoring its implementation. Today, we heard from him about the creation of a working group to work on this issue. We would like to ask, how long do we have to wait for results from the work of this working group? One of the options could be expanding the mandate of the UN Truce Supervision Organization, UNSO. This mission has more than 200 military observers, the numbers of which could be increased and which could be deployed, provided that the necessary additional resources are provided. We firmly call upon the Secretary-General to work on this option or to propose an alternative. Distinguished colleagues, speaking about the tomorrow of this conflict, it's also time to think about the day after tomorrow. There are many questions about ways to rebuild Gaza and, in general, the future long-term solution to the Palestinian question. And without a solution to that, it will not be possible to ensure a truly sustainable security situation for Israel. Russia is actively working in this direction. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, recently held a meeting in Moscow with members of the committee that was created upon the decision of the 11th of November extraordinary joint summit of the League of Arab States and the OIC in Riyadh on the situation in the Gaza Strip. Having determinedly condemned terrorism in all its manifestations, the participants spoke in solidarity in favor of a rapid establishment of a sustainable ceasefire regime and ensuring the protection of the civilian population. We need to remain also focused on preparing for the relaunch of the peace process on the internationally recognized basis affirmed in the UN and underpinned by the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which was advanced by King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and supported by all members of the League of Arab States and the OIC. First and foremost, this relates to the creation of an independent, integral, sovereign Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with a capital in East Jerusalem, which would coexist in peace and security with Israel. Clearly, in order to move towards this goal, alongside the efforts made to address the aforementioned acute humanitarian issues, a collective diplomatic mechanism will also need to be established. We are convinced that an important role in this mechanism must be played by countries in the region, Arab and Muslim states. The Quartet of International Mediators was essentially disbanded upon a U.S. decision. As you know, they refused to work in this format. Unfortunately, it did not include representatives of the Arab and Muslim world. It included Russia, the USA, the European Union, and the UN. In order to compensate for that shortcoming, long before the current events, we have been calling for the Quartet to work in full coordination with the League of Arab States. Our Western partners, to put it mildly, gave this a frosty reception. Unfortunately, the UN did not take the necessary initiative in this regard. As a result, the Quartet was not allowed to carry out its functions as entrusted to it by the Security Council of the World Organization. An updated mechanism for external accompaniment for coming up with the conditions for a long-term, lasting settlement on the basis of the two-state solution must be truly representative and include those in the region who don't worse but rather have a better understanding of how to achieve a just solution that would be based on the agreed international legal and treaty basis. We stand ready to do such work once the flames of this regional escalation have been doused. Unfortunately, there's still a long way to go until that happens. Thank you.
谢谢俄罗斯代表的发言。
I thank the representative of Russia. I now give the floor to His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdullah Al Thani, Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar.
Mr. President, at the outset, we would like to congratulate your friendly country for your wise presidency of the Security Council during this month, and we would like to thank you for holding this important meeting and giving us the opportunity to participate therein. And we would like also to thank the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Special Coordinator of the peace process in the Middle East for the efforts made towards de-escalation in Gaza. Mr. President, dear colleagues, the fraternal and brotherly Palestinian people have gone through hell during the last 7 weeks, and your august council is privy to the flagrant violations perpetrated during this conflict. And Qatar, since the very beginning, having faith in the diplomatic means of conflict settlement, started to coordinate with brothers and sisters in Islamic and Arab countries, and has started close communication with member states in the United Nations in order to put an end to the bloodshed and to address the humanitarian issues, including the release of hostages and the rapid humanitarian delivery. Last week, the relentless diplomatic efforts that were made according to the instructions of the Emir of the State of Qatar and in collaboration with the President of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and Joe Biden, the President of the United States, this culminated into an agreement to extend the humanitarian pause for 2 more days, and it led to the release of more than 90 hostages in the Gaza Strip and more than 210 women and children who were held in Israeli prisons. This truce has also made way for more humanitarian aid that are badly needed in the Gaza Strip. We would like to thank the members of the Security Council for welcoming those efforts, and we hope that the progress made should underpin the upcoming efforts to put an end to the bloodshed and to lead ultimately to serious discussions that would unleash or relaunch a political process to put an end to the suffering of the Palestinian people and to realize the aspirations of the Palestinian people. We would like also to commend the efforts of the member states of the Security Council that led to the adoption of Resolution 2712 as the first step on the right direction, which includes calling upon the parties to comply with the international law and which also calls for urgent humanitarian pauses and humanitarian access, together with releasing hostages and refraining from depriving civilians from basic services. We look forward to more steps to be taken by the Security Council towards a sustainable ceasefire and taking measures to guarantee the flow of sufficient humanitarian aid and to secure the delivery thereof without any impediments to all people who need the same in the Gaza Strip, including by establishing a monitoring mechanism to monitor the humanitarian aid delivery through all crossings, and we call upon the occupying power to abide by its obligations according to the international law. Mr. President, we would like to see the international law applied justly, without double standards and without preferential treatment to any party whatsoever, because the double standards which are applied by the international community regarding the carnages and the crimes perpetrated by the Israeli occupation against civilians and civilian infrastructure, together with relief teams, is a stain on the conscience of humanity, and it might also compromise confidence and trust in the international multilateral system. Actually, the current violence makes it incumbent on us, especially the Security Council, not to allow for the situation to continue. It is high time we took real measures towards comprehensive peace, and the recent events demonstrated that any attempt to circumambulate or to avoid the straightforward actions will only lead to the exacerbation and the escalation of the situation, as all these attempts will fail, because the Palestinian people will continue to exist and they will never give up their rights, especially their right to self-determination and their independence. Mr. President, we call for peace. We do not call for war. So instead of launching lies against Arab states, it was better to go back to the references and to the books and to ask this question: where is this peace agreement or peace plan that Israel agreed to and which Arabs refused? Because when we speak now about the day after, we have to reiterate that the Gaza Strip is part and parcel of the occupied Palestinian territory that should be governed by Palestinians, because only the Palestinian people should have the say in this regard. And we do reiterate that the region will not enjoy peace and security without internationally recognized legitimate solutions based on the two-state solution, and without the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the borders of 1967 with Eastern Jerusalem as its capital, and without the Palestinian people attaining all their rights. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Sameh Hassan Shukri Salam, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Egypt.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Mr. Wang Yi, Foreign Minister of China, dear participants. At the outset, allow me to extend my thanks to China, the current President of the Security Council, for its relentless efforts to lead the Council at this critical juncture and for supporting the calls to end the war in Palestine. I also thank the Secretary General for his valuable briefing. Dear participants, despite what has been already mentioned in our discussions, Egypt, and since the beginning of this conflict on the 7th of October, has been reiterating at the highest levels its condemnation of the targeting of civilians, whomever they are. We have firmly condemned the targeting of civilians, but despite all that, destruction in the Gaza Strip has reached unprecedented levels. More than 15,000 Palestinian civilians were killed, including 6,000 children and 4,000 women. More than half of the residential buildings in the Strip were destroyed. The whole health system has been targeted. 2/3 of the population has been displaced. Concurrently with the ongoing blockade, starvation, closure of the Israeli crossing points, and restriction of humanitarian access. These acts constitute grave and blatant violations of international law and international humanitarian law. It is a true humanitarian tragedy that cannot be justified under any pretext. However, surprisingly enough, some states that pretend to defend international law and human rights refrain from describing what is happening as a violation of international humanitarian law. They simply call for the respect of international humanitarian law, and their calls are left unanswered. The concept of self-defense cannot be invoked in grave violations of international humanitarian law. What right of self-defense would allow the occupying force to oppress, to destroy the lives of the occupied people? Which international laws legitimize self-defense against the same people languishing under occupation? International law demands the occupying state to respect the occupied people's humanity and basic needs. Mr. President, we have warned against the danger of targeting civilians in the Gaza Strip. However, the Israeli conduct for more than 50 days can only be interpreted as a deliberate policy to make life in the Gaza Strip impossible by targeting civilian and medical facilities, residential buildings, and pushing the inhabitants of the north to evacuate towards the south of the Strip, which is already densely populated and has been suffering from a harsh blockade for years. The policy of forcible displacement and mass transfer was rejected by the whole world. It represents a violation of international law. This policy is still the aim of Israel, not only through the statements and calls of the Israeli officials, but also by creating a new dire reality on the ground to expel the Palestinians of Gaza from their land and liquidate their cause by isolating the people from their land and confiscating it. This is happening in full view of the international community, which has failed repeatedly to put an end to annexation, demolition, settlements, and extrajudicial killings, which are all unlawful practices happening amidst the silence of the international community. Meanwhile, the occupying state persists in these practices. Mr. President, what is happening in Gaza in full view of the world is also happening in the West Bank. The same policy is expelling the Palestinians from the West Bank, either by unleashing the violence of settlers or through demolitions, expulsions, and military incursions in the towns of the West Bank, in addition to the annexation of land through systematic settlements that consolidate the illegal occupation. Egypt reaffirms before your Council its total rejection of any intent, plan, or attempt at liquidating the Palestinian cause by transferring the Palestinian people from their land occupied since 1967. Egypt warns against the consequences of such a conduct on peace in the region as a whole. Egypt calls the international community to stand firmly against all the practices which could lead to such a situation. Mr. President, today or the day after? That is the question. The answer is clear, based on logic and on international law. There is an urgent need to end this bloody war, to save lives, to protect civilians from the scourge of war, before contemplating the day after. Egypt is currently working on the implementation of the Security Council resolution pertaining to humanitarian pauses. Egypt succeeded in cooperation with Qatar and the United States in brokering a hostage and prisoners exchange that also includes assistance delivery to the north and south of Gaza. Egypt will continue its efforts to extend the pause, to reach a ceasefire, and to put an end to war and destruction. We call upon the Security Council to support these efforts and also to support holding the perpetrators responsible for the crimes they have committed against civilians, whomever they are. Since day one, Egypt has called for the release of civilian hostages and condemned any targeting of innocent civilians. We wonder, however, what is the position of the international community and of the Security Council vis-à-vis the Palestinian prisoners, the children and women who for years have been imprisoned in harsh conditions without charges or trials. Aren't those as well hostages taken by the occupying state? Furthermore, we are working with our partners and the committee that was created during the Arab Islamic Summit held in Riyadh to secure humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. In this context, we have tabled a draft resolution before the Council. This draft resolution is not politicized. It solely focuses on the humanitarian aspect and on saving 2.5 million innocent people in Gaza. We urge you to look positively at this draft resolution and to rise to the level of responsibility that this unprecedented humanitarian tragedy entails. We also urge to increase the scope of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. What has been provided so far, and Egypt has contributed 70% of that assistance, so what has been offered so far does not answer the needs of 2.5 million Palestinians. We also urge you to avoid double standards and to turn your sympathizing statements with the people of Gaza into action. Furthermore, we consider any objection to this approach as an endorsement of the blockade of starving women and children, denying them shelter and basic health care in extremely harsh conditions with the approaching winter. As for the day after, although the picture is not clear yet, considering the ambiguous goals of the current war, we believe that the only alternative is to address the root causes of the conflict and of all the sufferings we are witnessing today. There is a need to address the Palestinian cause in an integrated and comprehensive manner that would put an end to occupation. Anything less, and the results of our collective efforts will remain temporary. New cycles of violence will unfold, and peace and security will not prevail in the region, including in Israel. There's a need to put aside all vain statements and work hand in hand to implement the only internationally agreed upon solution, which is the two-state solution. This solution should be enforced and saved, not only supported by statements. At the same time, the member states that haven't done so yet should recognize the state of Palestine. I call upon your august Council to accept the full membership of Palestine at the United Nations. This lies at the core of the Council's mandate pursuant to the UN Charter. In conclusion, to all the actors interested in the day after, yes, it is time to work seriously. We stand ready to cooperate with anyone, with no exception, to set up a political framework and take the necessary measures to end the temporary stage that has started with Oslo. To start implementing the two-state solution by creating an independent, contiguous Palestinian state along the lines of the 4th of June, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is the day after that will restore the rights of the Palestinian people, provide security to the Israeli people, and allow all the peoples of the region to enjoy security, stability, coexistence, and cooperation for development and prosperity in line with our common human values. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Selim for his statement. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia chairs the ministerial committee mandated by the Joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit. I now give the floor to His Highness Prince Faisal bin Farham Al Saud, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Your Excellency, President of the Security Council, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I would like to thank the People's Republic of China for the wise manner with which it presided over the Security Council and for calling on holding this important session to discuss the grave developments in Palestine. I also thank the Secretary General for his important briefing on the implementation of Resolution 2712 adopted by the Council on the situation in Gaza. We appreciate his role and efforts in this concern. Mr. President, we gather here again in this Council under difficult and painful conditions in the Gaza Strip. Since the previous meeting, the number of civilian victims in Gaza exceeded 14,000, 67% of them women and children, and the number of persons displaced exceeded 1.5 million people displaced from their homes as a result of the appalling military escalation of the Israeli occupation forces in a continued violation of resolutions of international legitimacy and our shared humanitarian principles. However, we see that there's an absence of international accountability mechanisms, and the Council remains unable to take any measures that would prevent such violations. We categorically reject this bitter reality, and we saw the importance to act swiftly. Therefore, the Kingdom hosted the extraordinary Joint Islamic and Arab Summit in Riyadh. It was with the attendance of heads of state and government of member states in the League of Arab States and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The summit issued resolutions that reflect the will of Arab and Islamic peoples to stem the bloodshed, to deliver assistance, to put an end to violations, to overcome this unjustified suffering in Palestine, to stand with the Palestinian people, to achieve their legitimate demands, to take back their occupied territory and establish an independent state. And we call on the international community to shoulder this responsibility without any delay. Our message, Mr. President, is clear and unified. An immediate and permanent ceasefire that would pave the way for a serious peace process that is credible. And we call on countries that hope for peace and justice and that seek to maintain the legitimacy and strength of the international system, an international system which credibility was shaken following a slow response regarding this humanitarian crisis. We call on these countries to join us. Mr. President, we welcome the humanitarian truce. We value the efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States in this regard. This truth is a first step. However, it's not sufficient, especially given the continued restrictions on the number of aid trucks entering Gaza. We need to deliver assistance in a continuous, sustainable, and sufficient manner without unjustified restrictions or additional complications, because this situation of civilians can no longer bear any delay in accessing this urgent assistance. We also need to implement Security Council Resolution 2712 completely. We need to build on it so that we can reach a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire. This truce does not spare Israel its responsibility under international law and international humanitarian law. These weak pretenses regarding self-defense are unacceptable given the humanitarian tragedy that is unfolding in Gaza every day. The continued military escalation following this truth would be a shameful matter. Mr. President, we heard that providing assistance will not help us reach a solution. What will help us reach a solution, according to Israel? More bloodshed, more death? Israel needs to respond to the peace endeavors that have lasted for decades. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia presented an Arab peace plan in 1982. We also had the Arab Peace Initiative in Beirut in 2002. It was supported by the OIC, and the PLO recognized the State of Israel in 1993. Where is the Israeli peace plan? Where is the Israeli recognition of the state of Palestine? We are peace-loving nations, and peace has always been our strategic choice. But we also want it to be the choice of Israel as well. It is high time for an international recognition pursuant to a resolution from the Security Council of an independent Palestinian state. Palestine should receive a full membership at the United Nations. We call for an international peace conference facilitated by the UN so that we could implement the two-state solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency, His Highness Prince Faisal for his statement, and I will give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ayman Safadi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
In the name of God, the Merciful. Secretary General, President, distinguished colleagues. 33 days ago, my colleagues and I came before you to ask for the adoption of a resolution that calls for an end to be brought to Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people in the occupied Gaza Strip. The resolution wasn't adopted. The aggression has not ended. On the contrary, this aggression has become more barbarous, more cruel, and more deadly than before. Israel considered the Council's silence as authority for its crimes. It has killed 3,750 more Palestinian children since our last session on the 25th of October. And the number of victims of the Israeli aggression has reached 6,150 children, not counting the children under the debris, and the children who have died since the beginning of this aggression in the West Bank. The later is Adam Sameh al-Khul, who is 8 years of old, and another boy of 15 years of age who were killed yesterday by the occupation. Some of these children died due to white phosphorus used by the occupation. Others have perished due to illnesses, medication for which was, the delivery of medication of which was hampered by Israel, and others died under the ruins of their buildings. But we're sure about their death. This is the flagrant reprisals of and aggression of Israel, which is instrumentalized by others and is used under the pretext of self-defense. This is a flagrant violation of international law, which makes it black and white that the occupying power has no right to self-defense. This vengeance has killed 15,000 in the Gaza Strip. It has blocked the passage of 4,775 trucks over this period. And this is in line with the estimations of UNRWA, which indicates that the Gaza Strip needs 8,000 assistance trucks daily. This carnage breathes new life into Israelis that are used to denying the humanity of Palestinians, and they use their parliamentary platforms where they call for the death of Palestinians, where they call for their forced displacement, for their starvation, and to take away the right to their life and even their dignity. Those who wish to protect their populations shouldn't be taking away the lives of other populations. Settlers, they shouldn't be protecting their own terrorism. They shouldn't be occupying the other territories of other people and holding children without trial. The end of the occupation is the viable way to ensure peace for Palestinians and for Israeli people and for all people in the region. Those who purport to say that this conflict is a religious conflict are lying. They are trying to falsify history and to falsify reality, where we see this tragedy which has been exacerbated by the occupation due to this carnage on the basis of the suffering that's been caused. There is a conflict because there is an unfair occupation. There is a flagrant injustice which has stolen the history of a people and which has destroyed its future and present. Ladies and gentlemen, these attacks and the tears of those I call for you to not heed the arguments of those who have attacked the United Nations Secretary General, who have attacked the president of UNICEF, and who have attacked all of those who stand against the blockade and the violations of international law. We, the Arabs, have set forward a vision for total peace in which Palestinians and Israelis can benefit from security. Our Arab initiative goes back to 2002. What did Israel say about it? They refused our Arab peace initiative. What did Israel do with that? Not just consecrating this occupation. Ladies and gentlemen, we call on the Security Council to adopt a ceasefire, to bring an end to this aggression, and we demand that the international community bring an end to this occupation, to bring an end to the conflict. You all support the two-state solution. This solution brings an end, by definition, to the occupation. A new peace process instrumentalized by Israel is not the solution. There is only one viable path to peace that we all want. This path is that the Security Council adopt a resolution recognizing the Palestinian independent state with Jerusalem as its capital along the pre-1967 borders. This would be a resolution that would set forward a specific time frame and would bring an end to the unilateral illegal Israeli acts that further enshrines the occupation. Israel's acceptance of this resolution would allow us to ensure peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians, and would ensure that the entire region is on the path to a future away from all occupation and hatred. Israel refuses this resolution. It means that Israel wants to see persistent conflict in the region. Therefore, Israel must be circumscribed in its actions, and we must take all necessary actions to bring an end to that. Without that, the conflict will continue. After the war on Gaza, there will be other wars, because freedom has a door, as a way out at any time and for anyone. Israel has combated all efforts for peace for 30 years. In this way, it has denied peace and security for the entire region. We mustn't allow Israel to plunge the region into suffering for another 30 years. Ladies and gentlemen, the willingness for life is stronger than the willingness for murder. Freedom is stronger than pressure. This pause for Palestinians, the Palestinians during this pause have tried to go back and find their homes. And since the Israeli bombs stopped, children tried to go out into the street. We've seen families burying their dead, their wives, children, and then have called for the freedom of people. Those who want to call for justice should also be calling for freedom and for the right to life. Today is the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Let us retain this true solidarity to bring an end to this carnage in Gaza and the West Bank. The international community must reaffirm to Palestine that we are on the side of freedom and self-determination, and the international community is against the occupation. Ladies and gentlemen, occupation and peace must not coexist. occupation and security cannot coexist. We call for lasting, long-term peace. Peace is the only viable path. We must bring an end to the occupation and establish a Palestinian sovereign, independent state with Jerusalem as its capital and along the 1967 borders to live side by side in peace and security with Israel. This peace is the right of all peoples in the region. It is the right of Palestinians and Israelis. The path is clear, and it is an international responsibility to uphold it. I call on you to oppose all of those who do not wish to achieve this peace. Thank you very much.
沙瓦蒂先生阁下，我现在请土耳其外交部长费丹先生阁下发言。
Mr. President China for convening this meeting. We meet on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people to talk about yet another catastrophe that this noble and resilient nation endures. Almost all speakers before me addressed the gravity of the human tragedy in Gaza. Israel's brutal attacks on Gaza and its population constitute war crimes. We urge all civilized nations to disassociate themselves from those crimes. In such dire times, we need strong global institutions to enforce international law and protect moral compass of humanity. Unfortunately, the Security Council, which entrusted by the UN Charter to do so, time and again failed to fulfill its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. It was unable to call for an effective ceasefire with one voice. What is more, the Council cannot even present a remedy to undo the historical injustice that the Palestinians suffering for many decades. This paralysis will surely reverberate in coping with other global crises and further erode the Council's credibility in the eyes of humanity. It also wrecks the rule-based international system that the United Nations was established upon. Without international law, principles, and a moral compass, we are all in uncharted waters. If we do not fix this problem soon, we will all be haunted yet again by aggravated radicalism of all sorts, which will be feeding on impunity and injustice. Millions of people all around the world are rallying for solidarity with Palestine. The outrage and frustration of those masses in the face of Israel's atrocities run the risks of social upheavals in many countries. Their expectation from the Security Council is clear: ensure a ceasefire leading to cessation of hostilities and enable unhindered humanitarian assistance into Gaza. The extension of the humanitarian pause in Gaza, as well as exchange of hostages and detainees to that effect, are glimpses of hope. We are also following some scenarios about the day after with grave concerns. Those deliberations give further ammunition to Israel to uproot millions of Gazans from their homeland and to impose upon them an oppressive regime. Therefore, we should translate this dark episode into an opportunity to address the root cause of the conflict. Otherwise, the symptoms that we see today will be more catastrophic tomorrow. 11 years ago today, we have voted at the UN General Assembly to endorse the non-member observer states of Palestine. Once we allow the Palestinians to have their own functioning state with all rights, privileges, and capabilities of statehood, most of the challenges we face today would disappear. This time, we must all roll up sleeves and finish the work with a peace process based on two-state solution, which guarantees the ultimate safety of Israel and Palestine. Israel and Palestine should be able to live side by side in peace and security along pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine. We also have to make sure that such a settlement will be implemented, unlike past experiences. With this in mind, Turkey put forward the idea of guarantorship mechanism. Such a mechanism will safeguard peace and prevent any breaches from any of the parties. This could be envisaged in the process leading to the final agreement and become a part of the package. From the statements of our many partners, we understand that such a mechanism is indeed needed and supported. Before concluding, let me invite all our friends and colleagues once again to join hands and minds to stop the ongoing atrocities without delay and reverse long overdue historical injustice to the Palestinian people. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fidan for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Retno Marsudi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia.
Mr. President, I'm back attending the UNSC meeting because I want to be on the right side of the history to defend justice and humanity for the Palestinian. Mr. President, Indonesia remains enraged about the unfolding situation in Gaza. Indonesia is also increasingly very concerned with the evolving situation in the West Bank, with the increasing number of attacks to the Palestinians, including refugee camps. While as part of the humanitarian pause, prisoners are being released, on the other hand, almost the same number of new prisoners are being arbitrarily detained in the West Bank. When can this atrocity be stopped? What is to be fate of Gaza, West Bank, and Palestine? Will they have their future? Mr. President, I want to repeat what I've said last month in this room, that the UNSC has a big responsibility to maintain peace and security. For sure, I welcome the UNSC Resolution 2712, and I also welcome the extended humanitarian pause and the release of hostages and prisoners. Out of this small glimpse of peace, we could see hope. Families are reunited and it's reaching those in desperate need. But is it enough? No, it is not sufficient. Humanitarian pause is too narrow and too fragile and will not be able to create a better situation in Gaza. PM Netanyahu mentioned that he will start again full military operation when the humanitarian pause ends. I cannot understand his statement. And I further cannot understand if the Security Council let this continued threat against humanity to happen. The Council must act to preserve trust in the multilateral system. The Council must ensure that the hostilities do not return with vengeance and work together to move beyond a humanitarian pause into a durable ceasefire. Because another day without fighting is a day worth fighting for. A further action is needed to really give a significant impact in Gaza, West Bank, and Palestine. This action should contain, first, to deliver unhindered humanitarian assistance in a swift, adequate, safe, well-monitored, and sustained manner throughout Gaza. Second, to ensure adherence to international law, particularly international humanitarian law, where all parties safeguard human rights, protect civilians, uphold sanctity of public infrastructure, particularly hospitals, schools, places of worship, and the UN places of refuge. Third, the importance of a ceasefire to end all hostilities. Mr. President, do not forget that Palestine has the right to have an independent state based on two-state solution. It is the right time to restart the peace process. As we honor this year's International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, let us not turn a blind eye or remain silent to the struggle of the innocent people in Gaza, whose only sin here is being born Palestinian. I thank you very much.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Marsudi for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, dear Minister. Thank you for organizing this ministerial level briefing. It is my honor to address this Council for the very first time and to do this on the day of solidarity with the Palestinian people. Over the weekend, I concluded my trip in the Middle East. Together with my Portuguese colleague, we held numerous meetings in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Egypt. As emotions are running high on this topic, it is of utter importance to make way for diplomacy leading to a political solution. The United Nations and the Security Council should play a key role in this regard. First, a permanent ceasefire is urgent. People in Gaza are experiencing unspeakable horrors. I'm deeply disturbed by the blockade of Gaza and the lack of most basic items. In relation to yesterday's statement by the World Health Organization, I am particularly concerned over the health situation on the ground. I welcome that increased levels of aid have been distributed in recent days, and I urge for more crossings to be open. The aid delivered still falls below the dire needs. Let me inform that Slovenia has stepped up its humanitarian support and is ready to play an active role in psychosocial rehabilitation of children. I am appalled by reports of attacks on civilians and on schools, hospitals, UN facilities, and other civilian objects. The number of victims is devastating. 2/3 of all victims in Gaza are women and children. Civilians must be protected. What we are witnessing today in Gaza are clear violations of international humanitarian law. Even wars have rules. I welcome the agreement on the release of hostages and prisoners and a humanitarian pause. We commend the efforts of all involved, especially Qatar, Egypt, and US, in reaching the agreement. And once again, this conflict must end now. Collectively, we need to be able to condemn all forms of terror. I understand the agony, pain, and vulnerability of the Israeli nation following the brutal terrorist attack by Hamas on 7 October. And I once again call on Hamas to release all hostages immediately. Let me be clear. I condemn all forms of extremism. I'm deeply concerned about the impact of this war on the children of Gaza. I'm also troubled by the escalation in the West Bank, particularly the settler violence and announced expansion of additional illegal settlements, as well as in the south of Lebanon. This crisis will have broader future implications, including possible proliferation of extremism and extremist ideologies. Lastly, I would like to stress that the international community must do more. We Europeans are ready to be part of achieving long and lasting peace, and I thank the Secretary General, UNRWA, and the whole of the UN for their active role and clear call for humanity to prevail. Let me express condolences on the death of UN staff members in Gaza. We must recognize that we have failed the test of humanity. As an incoming member, I want to emphasize that this Council must step up. Mr. President, it has been 30 years since the signing of the Oslo Accords, and alarm bells in both the West Bank and Gaza have been ringing for years. This latest round of conflict is providing neither peace nor security to anyone in the region. And I therefore strongly support the convening of an international peace conference in order to agree on a peace plan leading to a two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peaceful coexistence. The only guarantee of the safety and security of Israelis is a recognition of the Palestinian state. Slovenia supports all initiatives seeking a politically viable solution to the conflict. And Mr. President, the images of the destruction and rubble in Gaza are devastating. Rubble under which many lives and families have been lost. rubble which children used to call home, rubble which many left behind to find a safer place. UNICEF recently posted a photo of 8-year-old Mohammed sitting on the rubble of his family home asking for a ceasefire. And if only one of my messages stays with you today, it should be me joining in his call for a ceasefire. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Fayon for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Zampri, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia records its appreciation to China as President of the Security Council for convening this important debate. I'm here bringing with me the message from peace-loving Malaysians under the leadership of Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, who have been deeply concerned and enormously distressed by the October 7 attack against civilians and the following vengeful and brutal slaughter of innocent life in Gaza. The heart-wrenching images of children killed, maimed, and shell-shocked in the aftermath of Israeli indiscriminate shelling of their homes, schools, and hospitals have shaken our human sensibilities to the core. Mr. President, Malaysia welcomes the adoption of Resolutions 2712 of the Security Council. We commend Member States for the wisdom to reach a compromise. The resolution was a breakthrough, outlining the urgently needed temporary measures to address the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. All parties must respect and implement the resolution in full. We therefore welcome the humanitarian pause, which began on 24th November, that had been extended. But we must note that this is not the solution. This must be the beginning for a lasting peace process and a permanent ceasefire. We regret that it took about 7 weeks before the humanitarian pause was agreed. It is outrageous that about 15,000 innocent civilians had to die, including about 6,000 children, before the deal for a humanitarian pause was reached. It was agreed only after Gaza had become a hell on earth and a graveyard for children, after half of the homes and buildings in Gaza reduced to rubble and more than 1 million inhabitants forcibly displaced. The pause was only agreed after more than 100 UN staff lost their life, making Gaza the deadliest conflict ever for UN employees. Mr. President, we must not let the killings of innocent life continue. No more children must die, be maimed, or orphaned. We must stop the war. Never allow anyone's hand be stained with the blood of the innocents, complicitly and directly. Malaysia calls on the Security Council to heed the resounding cry of concerned citizens of the world who have been demanding a ceasefire. It is also the unequivocal cause repeatedly made by the majority of the UN member states, UN agencies, and the Secretary General. Our focus must be to relieve the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, unhindered humanitarian access, and the supply of humanitarian aid, including life-saving essentials such as water, food, medicine, and fuel, up to scale throughout Gaza, must be guaranteed. Malaysia rejects the forced displacement of Palestinians, which is a clear violation of international law. Malaysia is deeply concerned with Israel's intention to unilaterally establish so-called safe zones, which has been rejected by the UN and other humanitarian agencies. Mr. President, the only way to achieve a just and durable solution to the Palestinian questions is by granting the Palestinian people their inalienable right to self-determination through the establishment of a free and independent state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Security Council must deliver on its responsibility and start taking all necessary steps to make the two-state solutions a reality. It is the solution that enjoys the overwhelming support of the international community and endorsed by numerous UN resolutions. The cycle of violence that has long been inflicted upon generations of Palestinians must end. They must emerge from the present darkness into a better, brighter future. Too much time has been wasted and too many innocent lives have been lost. The whole world is looking and counting on the UN, especially the Security Council. This body has failed for Palestinians too many times and for far too long. It is time to deliver. It is time to rectify these historical misadventures of the great powers that caused one of the bloodiest and unending killings of the innocent life since more than 7 decades in modern history. This is the clear message, not only from my fellow Malaysians, but from all peace-loving citizens of the world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Zampri for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmed Aboughait, Secretary General of the League of Arab States.
Shukran.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me, in my statement today, to focus on 4 main points. First, with every passing day, and while the Israeli aggression against Gaza continues, this passing day brings us further away from a sustainable peace. This destruction, this killing, this collective punishment practiced by the Israeli occupation is sowing hatred and rage in Palestine and the region, and these will last for years. They're causing wounds that will not easily recover. We need to make sure that we reduce hatred in our region, but how can we as they watch these scenes of brutal killing and violence? Those who hope for peace must recognize the danger of this ongoing open war that is managed in this way. The price of this ongoing massacre is not only endured by Palestinian civilians, children and women who have lost their lives or who have lost their loved ones. This cost will be borne by us all in the future. Therefore, it is necessary to work on ending this war immediately, to turn this humanitarian truce into an immediate, permanent truce and a complete ceasefire. We need to restore peace. We need to assist people in Gaza so that they can take back a modicum of a normal life. This is the responsibility of the Council, primarily, not just towards millions of civilians in Gaza, but also this is your responsibility to achieve a future of peace and stability in the region. Addressing the humanitarian catastrophe caused by the Israeli war machine, and we are seeing how appalling these acts have been with every passing day. This is an urgent international responsibility. We have seen people in Gaza trying to go back to their homes, the homes that were destroyed in the north of the Gaza Strip. We have seen how life, following 50 days of bombardment, has become impossible. The majority of the residents of Gaza became displaced inside their own country. They have no shelter. They have no basic necessities to live. Therefore, the delivery of humanitarian assistance in a sustainable and sufficient manner could mean the difference between life and death for millions of people in tents and in the schools of UNRWA in the south. Many are ignoring the fact that the assistance that is entering Gaza today is only the bare minimum required to meet the needs of its residents. This means a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of people. This means starvation and the outbreak of diseases. Therefore, it is your responsibility as a Security Council, and we look forward to a swift resolution that would pave the way for the delivery of assistance and basic items necessary for the survival of the residents of Gaza, whether food, medicine, clothing, fuel, through a swift mechanism that can keep up with the horrendous humanitarian catastrophe, and that would present the scenario of death by starvation or by disease instead of death by bombardment. It is true that ending the Israeli aggression is our priority, as identified by the Islamic Arab Summit. However, we also know how important it is to look towards the future, and we call on your august council to also look towards the political horizon of this painful situation. No matter how painful, how shameful the present is, however, the future must mean only one thing: the need for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state along the lines of June 4th, 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital. However, thinking about the future of the Gaza Strip without thinking about the Palestinian state, or thinking about the displacement of Palestinians or any other so-called security solutions, these solutions have proven to be a failure time and again. What we need to do now is to work swiftly to achieve the two-state solution. This solution has known parameters, terms of references that were agreed upon over 30 years ago. More importantly, this solution has international consensus. It is the essence of the Arab Peace Initiative that was launched over 20 years ago. And the only state rejecting the two-state solution is the occupying state. Therefore, implementing this solution on the ground requires showing courage and decisiveness with the occupation to remove any illusions concerning retaining the territory. all the territory while still achieving security. This is apartheid. This means no rights to the Palestinian people. This means no political horizon for the Palestinians to look forward to, and we reject that. The entire world rejects that. The way towards a two-state solution is not through endless negotiations. It should be through a decisive international will to implement this solution and to turn it into a reality as soon as possible by ending the occupation and establishing an independent Palestinian state. I believe that the current war against the Palestinian people in Gaza provides us with an opportunity that we should seize before we lose it. We are looking for a settlement that guarantees that these tragedies will not happen once again, a settlement that provides freedom and dignity to the Palestinian people and security and peace to the Israelis, a settlement that will only be possible if there is international will to turn it into a reality on the ground through an international conference that draws a specific path that is time-bound as soon as possible to end the last colonial military occupation on earth, to establish a Palestinian state, and to peacefully separate between two people with security guarantees from the international community to make sure that this settlement is sustainable. In the absence of such a settlement, we will witness a 6th and 7th and 10th and 20th war until the end of time. The war against Gaza has provided some positive outcome with the public opinion at the international level. It was a recognition of the universality of our moral values. It was a rejection of the blatant double standards. However, at the same time, we are seeing anger, disappointment, especially among Arab and Islamic peoples. A disappointment in the failure of the international system that is supposed to be based on rules and the respect of international law, disappointment towards those who speak about values and morality, and then they change their position as circumstances change as well. Therefore, restoring trust, the trust of people around the world and the trust of Arabs and Muslims particularly, their trust in the justice of international rules. This is necessary that everyone must pay attention to that, so that we do not see the consequences in the future of this anger. And we've seen throughout history how this anger could be exploited by extremism. The road towards restoring trust in this moment, the moment of truth, as we have heard from Secretary General Antonio Guterres, is clear. We need the right position based on humanity and ethics, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, or nationality. We should not reject international humanitarian law. We need to condemn anyone that violates international law, regardless of who is perpetrating this violation. We need to reject and condemn the killing of civilians, not in a selective or partial manner. This is how we protect the international community from the evils of the conflicts of civilizations and religions, and your august council plays a very important role in this regard. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abu Ghaid for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.